one day. If you had a choice of colors, which one would you use, my brothers? If there was no day or night, which would we prefer to be right? How long have you hated your black preacher who told you, no, how long have you hated your white teacher who told you to love your black preacher? If you had a choice of colors. 1969, Curtis Mayfield. A song that I heard is the soundtrack of my life. Because see, you gotta make some decisions. And that question in itself, if you had a choice of color, I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change it. What we've been through. The song said it in itself, glory, one day. We walked this far about that. In closing, no, I'm ready to get you.
Okay. We sing again.
No. In closing, my girl, I'm going to tell you her story, which is not only powerful, historic, but right here in the QC, we have so much to offer. From the history, to the her story, to the present, we got a lot to give. And there's more to give. Ladies and gentlemen, Shellie McDowell.
I'm going to have to condense it because it's a long story that has all of our family stories are long. I was just listening to Janet and her brother talk about the Cripps family. It's very interesting. I was talking to my cousin Gina, and I said, and Betty's from Rock Island. Anybody else from Rock Island in here? Okay, yeah, so there's a few of us, and my daughters were here, my grandsons. And I said, Gina, it's really fascinating that the Davenport stories are overlapping. I mean, we're part of the Davenport story as well, which is very interesting. This is Quad Cities. But anyway, our story, my story, part of my story begins with our great-great-grandparents who were slaves in Kentucky. My grandparents married. My grandfather was what they call a horse doctor, which meant veterinarian. And these are things that he learned as a slave on the farm. They didn't call it plantation. Interesting how I found this story out. I was having lunch with a reporter from the Quad City Times 20 years ago, at least, B.J. Elsner, and she was doing a story about mothers on Mother's Day. And I was having breakfast or lunch with her at the Village Inn, and she said, "Well, your last name is Moore." She said, "Are you in relation to Tim Moore, the actor?" And I said, "Yeah, that's my great uncle, Tim Moore, Amos and Andy." She said, "Wow." And then about 5 minutes, she said, "You know what? If Tim Moore was your great uncle, I know who your great great grandfather was." And I felt like, how dare you? I don't know who my great great grandfather was. So anyway, she was telling me these things, and they every so often they create a book called The History of Rock Island. They probably do it over here too. The Rock Island Historical Society does it, and they include these stories. In this book, there are not a lot of black stories, but what they do is they start off at the Rock Island Historical Society and see what they can find in their archives, and not very many black stories in there. It just so happened that John Hallberg, who was a famous historian in the Quad Cities, and especially in Rock Island, after the Civil War, he would go around and talk to and interview what he called the old settlers. Those were the people who were here before anything was formed. They settled these Quad Cities. My great-great-grandfather was a part of that group. And so, consequently, his papers landed at the Rock Island Historical Society through John Palmer. So the story is, and the story is told by my great-great-grandfather, because a lot of times you'll hear slave stories and narratives, and you don't know who's writing, you don't know whose interpretation. However, this was a story out of his own words. Now, this particular information appeared in the Rock Island archives, I think, in '95. So anyway, the story is that grandfather Charlie Wilson and Eliza Wilson, his wife, were slaves. Their master was Stephen Wilson. Some of the information that I got is that this Wilson was a state senator. He also owned horses, and because he owned horses, and he owned a lot of horses, he would race these horses. Charlie, our grandfather, started off as a jockey. He was a little guy. Some of the research that I read tells me that most of the horse jockeys back then were black. I mean, doesn't that make sense? You know, they weren't getting paid or anything, but they had to, if this was the thing that was going to be done for their masters, for their bosses, then they were riding these horses. Until he gained, too much weight, and then after that he learned just about everything that he could learn, had to learn on this farm. One of those things was how to doctor animals. At a certain point, several years before the Civil War ended, when the Union Army came through that county, in grandfather's words, groups of the men from his farm and neighboring farms would gather at night, would steal away at night to plot and plan how they were going to join the Civil War. And they actually were able to do that. Grandfather Charlie Wilson was involved in a few battles, but his last assignment with his company was here at what is now called the Rock Island Arsenal, which was then a Confederate prison. And so his group, his company, actually was guarding prisoners there when the war ended. So they stayed in Rock Island for 10 years. And then because he'd met someone who could find him work. It was all about work. It was all about work. They moved to Port Byron. They were only black family in the town, but they had work at this lime kiln. And he was a fireman, which it was somebody who kept the fires going in this factory, this lime kiln. But he was also one of the 2 veterinarians in Port Byron. So he was an important person in this town. And we didn't know that until after this article appeared in the paper. We started getting calls from the Port Byron Historical Society because he was one of their heroes. People who are into history, like these people who joined these historical society, they know who their people were from these times. And Charlie and Eliza Wilson, because they were the only black family for years. I mean, they died in Port Byron, and their I think grandmother was in her late 60s, and Charlie lived to be in his 70s, which is a huge deal for them to live that long. But they lived, died, and were buried at the old Port Byron cemetery. So anyway, these people from Port Byron, they started calling us, and there was a family there who actually had our grandfather's old tools. I mean, they were rusted out, but they were intact in a toolbox. And my Aunt Julia drove to Port Byron and picked them up. And then about 10 years ago, the Port Byron Historical Society invited us to come to attend one of their meetings because they had to meet Charlie's family. I mean, just a huge, and we didn't know what we were walking into. They wanted to hear stories, but, we had a few stories, but, we walked in there and there was a standing ovation because Charlie's family came back to Fort Byron. Who knew, that it was going to be that important? So I'm going to read you some of Charlie's words. Charlie Wilson was born in a dirt-floored slave shack on a tobacco plantation in antebellum, Kentucky. In his lifetime, he became a free man, served in the U.S. Army as a guard of Confederate prisoners on the Arsenal Island, and witnessed the reunion of the North and South before moving to a small riverside town in Illinois. It was in Fort Byron that he thrived, held in the highest esteem by the all-white community. Mr. Wilson's incredible story might have gone unrecorded beyond family folklore, and I have to put a pin here because we didn't know this story. Now, and that's another conversation. A lot of us don't know those stories. Now, I asked my father, I remember that fateful lunch at Village Inn, because I was a little ticked off that this white woman said she know my story. And so I excused myself and went to the restroom, but I did, on the way to the restroom, I got on the payphone, and I called my dad. And I said, Dad, I'm having lunch with this woman, and she's white, and she's nice. But she said she knows our great-great-grandfather, and he was a slave in Kentucky. Please tell me that this is not true. Now, I'll be all right with it if it was true, but please don't tell me that you didn't tell me. He didn't even know. He remembered, he said, visiting as a young kid, visiting Fort Byron. Wow. But he didn't know. He said, but go ask Aunt Sis. Now, Aunt Sis is my cousin aunt, Julia McDowell, who lives in Rock Island. Some of you know Jay McDowell. He's a fireman, fire chief or something in East Moline, isn't he? Yeah. And so, but anyway, it's his mama. So I called her up and I said, Aunt Julia, Dad said, and she says, well, yeah. Yeah. Well, see, her father, Uncle Art, was a family historian. So he figured, if anybody knows, call Aunt Julia. And Julia, and she just waited for somebody to ask. They wouldn't sit nobody down telling them, gather around, children, let me tell you who you are. That didn't happen. So I said, you got some pictures? And she said, yeah. She said, I got a few. Come on over. Went over there and her dining room table, was a massive dining room table, mound of pictures. Wow. Pictures of Charlie Wilson and Eliza Wilson. And Charlie had a brother who belonged to another boss, as he called it, or master on a neighboring farm. They didn't live together. It was his brother. His name was, oh my God. His last name was Terry. And he was in his Civil War uniform in this picture. Because I went there with doubts. And I'm just looking at picture after picture after picture and turning it over and looking at dates and names. And it was incredible. You walked into Disney World, but it's surreal. Because here is all this information that's valuable. And so B.J. Elsner was the reporter's name from the Quad City Times. She found this history book and actually brought it over to myself and my parents so that they could read it. And so, anyway, so here's some of his stories. He says, this is how he starts his narrative. I ain't got no story to tell. I stayed with my old boss on the plantation until 1864. I left home on the 4th of July. Lincoln hadn't freed the slaves at that time. We just pulled out and went anyway. Our bosses were bitter against us going to war. The Yankees put guards at all the railroad stations to keep rebels from getting us back. Well, I tell you, it was funny. In one case, we laid at the depot and the guard was there to keep the Johnnies from taking us. A fellow named Gatewood had a man there, a slave there, and he came after him. He said he was going to take his slave back home with him. The guard popped a bayonet into his thigh and pushed him off the platform. That scared the balance of the rebels away, and we didn't have no more trouble. They all left. Company E, 108 U.S. volunteers is what I belong to. All colored troops went to U.S. volunteers. They didn't go by states like the whites did. We had Captain Tuttle. From lieutenant up was white, but corporals and sergeants were of our own people. I was a corporal in Company E. My boss, master, William Martin Wilson had about 60 slaves. He had blooded race horses, different breeds, fine cattle, fine sheep. He had stallions, and I looked after them. He was a good horse doctor, and the trainer was a horse doctor, and I learned to doctor horses. When a neighbor's horse got sick, he came in my place while I went over to doctor his horse. The more I did, the more I studied and learned. I made up my mind when I was a boy that I wanted to be a horse doctor. I was born in 1836. I don't know the date exactly, but my mother remembered it was January. Sometimes they wrote our ages in the Bible, but when we left, they wouldn't accommodate us that much to tell us. Wilson's house burned afterward, and they saved nothing from it. The Bible was burned too. My brother, Sandy Terry, belonged to one of the other girls who married a Baptist preacher by the name of Terry. He baptized all the slaves that would come. And what do you suppose he done when we was going to join the war? He said he was going to take all their names off, and there wouldn't be any salvation for them. By jinx, that was a foolish idea. What harm would that do to them? I know better than that. He thought if he'd take our names off, we'd be lost. My sister belonged to the same man I did. She came with us and got married in Rock Island after the war. Married a man by the name of Morris. While I was riding horses, I got acquainted with all the big men in Kentucky and Tennessee. Bob Garvin came to the train. Bob Garvin came to the train when we were leaving to go to war. He came to the window and said to me, "Well, Charlie, so you're going to leave, old Mr. Wilson." I said, "This is a new deal, Mr. Garvin. This is different. You know, when you turn your canary out of his cage, he don't come back. He's free." Tears came to his eyes, and he said, "Well, Charlie, I hope you good luck." I'd been a prisoner all my life, and this was a new deal. We thought a lot of being free. Let's just pause for one second. Mr. Wilson was mustered out of, this is the information from the paper, mustered out of the Army in the spring of 1866 and lived in Rock Island until 1876 when he went to work for Al Lyford in his Fort Byron mine camp. So anyway, grandfather Charlie Wilson died April 26, 1920 at the age of 84, which is, isn't that awesome? I said 84. Leaving behind a son, 6 daughters, and several grandchildren buried at the Fort Byron cemetery. Isn't that awesome? Yes, yes. So anyway, in this picture here, there's also, okay, here's the story. So Charlie had several children, and one of them was a girl, a couple kids born during slavery, came here. And so one of the girls named Cynthia, they were living in Fort Byron. Now, she married a man, our great-grandfather, by the name of Harry Moore. Now, the story is from Aunt Julia that Harry Moore came from somewhere around Boston. Now, she didn't know how he got here, what work he did, and I can only guess because, you know, we're talking about transportation and commerce and things like that, and we're talking about trains and the river. So I can only guess that he come up here one of those two ways. And in my creative or crazy mind, I'm thinking great-grandmother Cynthia was standing on the banks of the river, and he come through there, and and he saw this, sweet little thing, and then like my mama said, she had what's that? A fine brown frame. But or she was standing at the train depot. Either one of those. And because how else would that have happened? She was living in Port Byron. And so they got married, and they lived in Rock Island. So that's how the Moore family got there. His name was Harry Moore. So that's part of the Moore family. And so Harry and Cynthia, there's a picture of them and their 7 sons. Cynthia's here, and you guys will be able to see this when I'm done. And Harry's sitting there in front of his sons with his head cocked back like Popeye and a corn cob pipe in his mouth. And I heard stories that he wasn't nothing nice. They had a house. Anybody know where Derek's Temple is in Rock Island? Their house was on that, right there in that vicinity, right there. And didn't nobody come in his yard. Cynthia Moore and Harry Moore seated along with their children, Raymond, Harry, and Tim Moore's real name was Harry. Kenyon, Arthur, and there were a set of twins in this group. William, who was our grandfather, and Charles. And here's a picture of Charlie in front of his home in the early 1900s, taken by John Harvard. Charles is among that group. And here is a picture of one of the pictures of Charlie Wilson. Looks like almost a full head of hair and gray beard and all that other stuff. I don't want to keep you guys, but that's just a fascinating story. And I think, the story was handed, just given to us, as a gift. And I think we've done some things just in terms of sharing the story, but I got a feeling we haven't done enough, and we will continue. And I think that I've always been interested in history, just because, just like everybody else's family, people sat around just talking. Like my father said, we just sit around here lying. You ever hear that? Yeah. Sit around here lying. Now, our connection to, very quickly, to this Davenport group is that my parents, my father had 2 brothers, Uncle Gail, who was Gina's father, Uncle Robert Moore. Some of y'all knew my Aunt Clarice tonight.
Clarice Moore.
Okay, y'all knew Aunt Clarice.
Oh yeah.
From Davenport now. Okay, anyway, her husband Robert was my father's brother, and sister Elizabeth Quick, and Pearlie Posey. And so anyway, they were born, I believe, in Rock Island. And then at some point, my father's mother's name was Thelma. Thelma and Robert divorced. The kids lived with our grandfather in Rock Island for a time. So, and the rest of the Moore family lived in Rock Island, so they were back and forth. So our grandfather passed away when my dad was 14, Gail was 16, they were like 2 years apart, all of them. And so my father, Uncle Gail, were just big time athletes. They were just, there's actually a picture of my father in 9th grade, broad jumping. He had the longest jump of any 8th or 9th grader that in the country. And his picture was like in the almanac or something that year. And so anyway, that was at the time, would have been around the time when our grandfather passed away. And so the coaches and everything wanted Uncle Gail and my dad to stay in Rock Island with family. Grandmother lived in Davenport. They decided to move on to Davenport. So they started this Davenport saga. But they already knew these people because they were always back and forth, right? So their best friends were Bill, WC. We've known WC since we were babies, and Jethro Cribbs. The Blands, the Overtons, the Harrises, Fred's father. I mean, they talked about these people all the time. What's his name's father? Anthony. Griffin. Yeah, Flynn. They talked, So I knew these people, right? So anyway, they decided they would stay here, and they were athletes here in Davenport, very active. My father talked about how they would let them play baseball at Davenport High School. They allowed them to play, to run track. He said they didn't really coach. They just had, but they were. He said we tried to beat everybody we could, just like because WC was one of his best friends. They were the same age. My father was the first football. He shared co-captain responsibilities with his wife, the student. His picture was in the paper for that. My Uncle Gail was a pole vaulter. Who knew, right? So anyway, we grew up that way, very entrenched in sports. I have some other pictures. So up on the piano. Yeah, but I'm going to show this picture here. This is a picture of our grandfather, my father at 12, other various uncles, my Uncle Gail. Anybody remember Eddie Teague from Rock Island? Well, here he is, Janet, as a 14-year-old, I think. Chuck Moore. I don't know if you guys know, but there are some All-Britons, in this picture, there are All-Britons, there are Teagues, there are Hollands, you name it. They're teenagers in this picture, and here's my father now. Anyway, we're going to close, because we've been here a long time. We're going to, we had passed songs. This was one of the first songs I ever learned. To me, it's a marching song. It's a declaration. It's a march. Yeah.
Back in the day, old school. That's right.
Okay, we can do that. Let's start. Debbie, ready to start it off now? Boom, march. Boom, boom, boom. I can sing. Boom, boom. We come
This far by faith, leaning on the Lord, trusting in His holy word.